Well, so dear colleagues, I'm very happy for this new semi-web, to introduce you to our colleague from San Francisco State University, Brian J. Beatty. So just to give a very short summary of your career, which started right after your PhD from Indiana University that you got in 2002. You started as an associate professor in instructional technologies in 2003, teaching various classes like instructional systems design, instructional design, theoretical foundations of instructional technologies, or distance education, just to give a few examples. Then between 2012 and 2020, you were Associate Vice President for Academic Affairs at San Francisco State University, directly supervising a unit responsible for teaching and learning technologies. As for your research, your primary area of interest are social interactions online, flipped classroom, and instructional design theory, especially for HyFlex learning environments. So, well, many of you have probably never heard before the term HyFlex, which is a portmanteau, in French, un mot valise, for hybrid and flexible learning environment. In a nutshell, and before letting you develop on this idea, it's basically about offering different modes that learners can pick or switch to during the course. And of course, considering the context we're all facing right now with the pandemic crisis, we've all had to adapt, or even better to say, adjust our teaching practices to all the constraints that we had. And I hope that, well, what you're going to tell us about this HyFlex model will help us get some inspiration for our teaching strategies for the time being and for the years to come. Well, the floor is all yours.
All right, so thank you very much. You'll have to make sure that you keep me on track as far as time. So I want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions that you may have. And so we do have the chat window available. I have it available over here. So if you have a question that's inspired by something I've just said, please add that to the chat. And if I have the opportunity, I'll answer it then. If not, I'll make sure that I try to save some time at the end for other questions that maybe have not been put into the chat yet. And if anyone is moderating the chat, if you see a question that would be something we should answer right away, don't hesitate to interrupt me. I teach a lot of graduate students, and so I'm used to being interrupted by questions, and I think that's a good thing. So what I'm going to do is share a presentation, and I'll share the slides with you also after we're done today. There are more. I've been talking about this on and off for 15 years, but especially the last year, several times a week in webinars and other kinds of workshops and things like that. And so I have a lot of slides here that we're not going to cover all of this, but I will provide it to you if you want to explore it a little bit more deeply. So before I kind of get started, I just wanted to briefly review where I've been. I am a faculty member. I have been an administrator in higher education for about 8 years, overseeing academic technology. Before that, I was an e-learning designer, and I did a lot of corporate training, and I also was a classroom teacher in our K-12 system. I taught in our high school system, math and science and computer applications, which eventually led me into educational technology. Before that, I was in the technical training area in the Navy, actually in our nuclear power area. And there is an open educational resource, an open book, a free book that you can access that explains, was released in 2019 before the pandemic, but it was also kind of talking about the 15 years that we spent developing this and what others have been doing as well. I'm going to talk a little bit about what it is like in a HyFlex course. How do we support students in multiple modes, which is what we're calling HyFlex. And we'll talk about engagement, assessment, little bit about design, and then aligning systems and resources and to support. And we can spend more time on any of these topics that you may have questions about. Really, HyFlex, in a nutshell, as you were saying, is a pretty simple idea. We're combining face-to-face students in the classroom, a lecture hall or an active learning classroom, or just seats in a regular classroom, with online students as well. And sometimes these students are online synchronous. Sometimes these are students who are just online asynchronous, or sometimes they could be both. It depends a lot on the institution and the faculty desire and the technology and the skills with using technology, et cetera. But for HyFlex to work, for it to be really HyFlex, the core elements of the definition are you have a face-to-face component and you have at least one online component, and you let students make that choice. We had to give students that choice because we couldn't tell them what was best for them if we were going to give them these options. And we also wanted to give them the flexibility. We needed to provide flexible opportunities for our students. We were teaching a graduate program. We did not want to be a fully online graduate program, yet we knew we were limiting ourselves and students who could complete our programs and our courses by not having an online component. We couldn't afford a fully online program, and it turns out we really didn't want one. We wanted a program that that gave us the opportunity for the rich in-class interactions and relationship building and networking, but also provided the opportunity for access to those who could not be there at that time, at that location. So that's where HyFlex came from. Back in 2005 was our first idea of this. In 2006, we started writing about it. We do have a formal definition at our campus. This is the third version of this, refreshed last spring. And it basically just says that students can choose to attend class either assigned face-to-face environment or in an online environment, which could be synchronous, it could be asynchronous, or it could be a combination of both, what we're calling bicronous now. This bicronous term started being used in the literature in April this last year. And so that's when we're combining it. Actually, on our campus now, we have very few on-campus courses. Most of our classes are fully online. Many of us teach synchronous. Some teach asynchronous. And then I teach in more of a HyFlex bicronous format where I do a face-to-face, or not a face-to-face, but a synchronous session, much like this, every class. And I also have an asynchronous option for students who cannot be there at that particular time. That schedule flexibility for students was important before COVID. It's even more important now. And that's one of the things that I think will help us continue to see HyFlex expand as we see the opportunities to provide more access for students and the skills that we have and the technology that we have and the capabilities that we have to serve students that way. There have been 4 key principles around HyFlex that we've been using for our 15 years or so on this adventure, and these have not changed. Some institutions that adopt HyFlex approaches may change the names of some of these, especially reuse. Reuse doesn't really say anything to some people, but maybe it's more around community. But I'm going to go through each one real briefly just to explain what this is. Since this is a principle-based approach, what we do is we tell people and we tell our faculty, these are the things we want you to try to do in your courses. We want you to support these ideas. But how you're actually going to do that is largely up to you. Okay? So the principles provide a framework. Within that framework, the individual decisions that faculty and instructional designers use, or even department kind of leadership makes about what it's going to be like in their programs, varies quite a bit. And that's, so we have our own flexibility in this as well. When we talk about alternatives, we're basically saying that there has to be a fully developed participation alternative between classroom and online. There could be more than one online alternative, but to meet the definition of HyFlex, the principle is you have alternatives available for students. When we talk about equivalency, we have the idea here is that we know that the different paths that we're going to provide to students provide slightly different learning experiences, sometimes substantially different. If you think about interacting in a live classroom discussion compared to interacting in an asynchronous online discussion, those are very different experiences. Can you still meet equivalent or the same learning outcomes? Well, certainly, depending upon the design of the discussion or the design of the other activities, you can meet the same learning outcomes in most cases. So the point of this principle is that if you're going to be creating a HyFlex course and you have alternatives, each of those alternatives should lead to equivalent learning. Basically, the same learning outcomes are being met. one of the first things we do in the design stage is ask that question. Can we adequately support students meeting learning outcomes online if we've been doing it face-to-face, or face-to-face if we've been doing it online? And if the answer is no, then we have to reconsider whether or not this is a good approach, or maybe we need some sort of a combination of a regular classroom and then maybe some elements of hybrid or HyFlex. So maybe it's not a good fit for a full HyFlex. So that's one of the first things that we want to look at is are the learning outcomes. The third principle I call reuse. Some people call this community. And the idea here is that what I want to do is everything I'm using for in-class students, I want to also use for online students and vice versa. I try to capture what we do in the classroom as much as possible and use it with online students. So sometimes that's an audio recording. When I started, it was just audio recordings, but then we added in the video recordings. Now we do, if we're doing synchronous students live, we have a natural way to record what's going on in the classroom. And so we use that and we provide that to online students. But that's not the only thing online students get, the asynchronous students get. We also kind of build the course as a fully online asynchronous course. So all the materials, all the activities, they're all developed and designed for online asynchronous students. And then we use that same set of materials, those same activities largely in the classroom. And we use those with our synchronous students as well. So I'm not building 3 courses here. Not building 3 courses. I'm not teaching 3 courses or even 2 courses. Building 1 course, teaching one course of students, one body, one community of students, and by reusing the things we do in the classroom with online students and vice versa, we get more of that learning community aspect with students. That's an important part to make. So when I think about the reuse principle, it also helps me manage workload. I'm not going to build 2 versions or 3 versions of everything. I build 1 version and use it in multiple ways as much as possible. Sometimes there are standoffs, of course, where you have an individual thing. This is only going to work for asynchronous students, or this will only work in the classroom. As long as those don't limit the learning outcomes being met, we're okay with that. And the last principle is about accessibility. In the United States, we have a federal law that requires us to make our documentation and our courses accessible for students. But we also talk about access to networks and access to bandwidth. This has become even more critical this past year, as we've seen many of our students who have no longer had access to the classroom or the campus, quite honestly, and all its resources, have had to find their own networks, their own technology, and the skills to use those to learn online. And for most of our students, that hasn't been too much of a problem. But for some of our students, it's been a major issue where they don't have a laptop or tablets that are good enough to really do well in an online course to interact with all the materials and activities, or they don't have the bandwidth, or they have intermittent network connections, or what we've seen surprisingly to many of us was they don't have a place where they can sit and participate in a live class, on a reasonable basis. And so that all of those things are important. So if we find that if we're providing something like HyFlex, one of the things that we try to pay attention to as an institution is what extra supports do our students need. We have laptop checkout programs, so students can check out a laptop for a semester from the university. They can use it all semester. We give them wireless access points to take home, if that's what they need. And there are other solutions like that. So accessibility is more than just the legal requirements. I also want to acknowledge that there are many more words or names for this other than just HyFlex. I started using the term HyFlex, I think, publicly in about 2006. But there are other words that have come out in the literature since then. The ones that I have here on the top half of the screen are created environments that were just like HyFlex. Some of them came from a HyFlex idea they heard about at a conference or maybe in a workshop. Others just developed the same idea on their own because it worked well for us. It was a good idea for us. And so it's not surprising that it would be a good idea for others as well. Below the line are other aspects of multimodal instruction that aren't necessarily HyFlex. There's no real emphasis on the flexibility component of this. And so I just distinguish them slightly differently. These are all versions that were available by late 2019. Last year, we saw many other institutions coming up with HyFlex, and especially when they wanted to change it a little bit for their particular situation, they have their own terms. So ShenFlex and GoFlex and StartFlex and all these other kinds of things. ChicoFlex I just heard the other day. And so there's a lot of different terms out there that are being used for this. But even before COVID hit, there were hundreds of faculty in dozens of institutions that were using this. And it's not just in the higher education space. There's also some K-12 schools, especially at the high school level, maybe grades 6 to 12, oftentimes would find HyFlex to be good for them. The whole point was when we had a need, and when there's a need for supporting both online students and face-to-face students with the same resources, then HyFlex might be a good choice. So what is that experience like? Let's talk a little bit about that. Well, I teach graduate seminar courses primarily. We have some other undergraduate courses in our program. But in any given week, if I have roughly 15 to 25 students in the classroom, I see a pattern something like this, where I see, in normal times, most of the students wanted to come to class, 60% or more in situations. Now, this isn't for every class. This isn't for every instructor. This is the pattern I saw in my courses. Occasionally, we'd have a course where more students wanted to do it online. And especially, we had a few courses in our program where, for whatever reason, the students didn't want to come into the classroom. They preferred to do it online synchronously. They wanted synchronous, but they didn't want to travel to the classroom. And so occasionally we find that this is a great shift off to the right here on the screen. And when that happens, we have to be able to adapt to that. When we meet like this, and the next week we would meet in class, some of the students are changing their position. Some of the online students come into the class. Some of the classroom students go online, and sometimes it shifts between asynchronous and synchronous. So we have to be ready to manage, kind of different numbers in different places. So what that means in the classroom for me is that I have to have a plan. Now, I almost always have enough students in the classroom to make it feel like a regular classroom. But there are occasions where the number of students in the class, it might just be 3 or 4. In some cases, for very small classes, it might just be 1 or 2 students. And if you're planning for a group of 15 students or even a dozen students and only 2 are there in the classroom and everybody else is online, as a faculty member, you have to be willing and able to manage that change. So I always have a plan B. Typically in a class, the participation pattern settles out after a couple of weeks, and you know pretty much what to expect, because students are typically choosing a path that fits best for them most of the time, and it's pretty consistent. But now I have I have a plan so that if I only had 2 or 3 students, I know what I'm going to do in the class. It might be that we go through content more quickly. It could be that we treat it like a big breakout, one big breakout group going through, some sort of interactivity thing. But we also find ways to connect the synchronous students with online students. For me, when I was tracking this, I had about 10 or 15% of the students who were making a choice to change their mode from week to week. Not the same students changing every week, but overall, an average of about 10 or 15%. There's a question in chat, any student without interaction? Well, there's always interaction that's available, and I would facilitate. Some students choose to interact a lot less than other students, just like they do in your classroom. Some students will come into the classroom, and unless you're actively engaging with them and requiring them to do something, they might just sit there and listen, or maybe not even listen so much, but they're sitting there because someone has told them they had to be there for the class. Okay, so we have the same situation online, right? For online asynchronous students, if you've taught online asynchronous students, you know that if there's not a specific requirement for there to be some interaction, they may not be very engaged with the class. They could be very engaged with the content, learning more independently, but there are still a lot of students that tend not to engage if you're not asking them or requiring them to engage, or it's not inherently motivating for them to be engaging in the content. Synchronous students the same way. You could have synchronous students, even in a webinar, and if there's if they're not interested in what's being talked about by whoever is presenting, or the interactions happening, or they're not required to interact, then many of them, might just be checked out a little bit. They may not be paying attention, just like in the classroom. It's similar, it's different aspects. It shows up differently, but you still have the challenge of engagement in every single mode. And so that's one of the real challenges for faculty, is how do we create engaging environments? in all the different modes. We'll talk a little bit more about that. I have some of the slides talk specifically about engagement with some resources and some suggestions. Overall, this is the participation mode I saw with HyFlex in the early days. Now, when I'm teaching online now, and I have to give them a choice between synchronous and asynchronous, I have some classes that are almost everybody is there synchronously, and very few students choose to do asynchronous. I have other classes though, same semester, same overall group of students, and I have 80% of them are doing it asynchronously, and only 20% are showing up for synchronous sessions. I don't know if it's a time challenge. There are different times of the day, late afternoon or evening. I don't know if it's the content. I'm going to ask my students a little bit more later this semester, but this is the first time I've had a class where most of the students are choosing to do the work asynchronously, and I'm trying not to take it as a personal, they don't like being in the synchronous class with me because they show up for other classes synchronously. So I think there's a time component of this, but the point is they have the flexibility. So this is my overall average mode in general, but that does still change. Now, when we teach this with a double course, sometimes what we would do in the early days, trying to figure out how to manage workload and how to manage enrolling students better. We would list a section of the course online and list a section of the course face-to-face and allow students to register for either one of those. Once they registered, then we would tell them, you registered for this online course, but you can also take it face-to-face, and this is when it meets. You're welcome to come to class. For the students who registered for the face-to-face class, we tell them, you registered for this face-to-face class, and here's when it meets. However, you can also do it as an online class. So essentially most of the students, the first time they encountered that, didn't really know what we were talking about. So they would come to class and then we would talk to them. I would tell them what they could do. That's when we had this idea of this double course idea. In those situations, we found more students were more likely to stay in the mode that they registered for, in part because sometimes they registered for an online course because they could not make it to campus for the face-to-face class. So it's not surprising that they would continue to be online students. And yet they had the option, and some of them would take the option of coming into class. In other situations, when we didn't have that register for online or register for face-to-face, we found more students were more active in the classroom because that's the kind of class that we listed in the registration system. And then we would tell them after they registered, oh, by the way, you could also do this online, and here's how you do that. So we just were tracking that. Now, we did teach this on campus with some larger classes too. And we had one class that was actually a large required course in our business program. And it was a lot of students, 1,200 students in this particular course. All of the business majors had to take this class their first year in the degree program. And we taught it in a very large, initially we taught in a large lecture hall. At one point, we lost that lecture hall. We couldn't use it. So we needed to find a solution to allow this very large class section to fit into a much smaller room. And so HyFlex was the solution that we chose. Actually, we didn't call it HyFlex in those days. We ended up using a lecture capture solution. And the model for teaching the class was a lecture and quizzes and tests online, a lecture in person, quizzes and tests online. And so for students who didn't want to come to the lecture hall, they could watch it as a live stream, or they could watch it as a recorded session. I think this is a weak teaching model, but it worked just as well online as it did in the classroom. I don't think it was ideal in the classroom, and it wasn't ideal in the online world from my perspective. And yet it met the requirements, and the students met the same learning outcomes no matter which mode they were choosing. So you may have situations in your own courses. If you have large classes, we have some large classes on campus, and for several reasons. One of them is financial. We might teach them as very large class sections and have a relatively weak teaching model, and yet that's part of the way we do our business. Ideally, we'd be back at 35 students or less in every class, but that's not the world that we live in the California State University system. So anyway, there's a difference there. So this is an undergraduate course. Students were less engaged in the content. This happened to be a marketing class, but these business students, not all of them were marketing business students. Some of them were more interested in accounting, or finance or other kinds of aspects of business. And so this would be like what we call in our country general education requirements, where students have to take a history, a philosophy, language courses, others, even if they're going to be an engineer, right? So if they're not that engaged with the content, it's more likely that if you give them the choice, they will probably gravitate to a less engaged path because they may not be that interested in actually engaging with the content in an active sense. So that's something to be aware of. So the point of this is, if they're going to move online, you have to make sure that the asynchronous version or even the synchronous version of your course online is not easier for them. Okay, it has to be rigorous, or they will all probably move online unless they actually like seeing someone's face who's talking to them. So you can't make an easier path for students. It has to be rigorous. Well, when I would survey my own students, I wanted to make sure they were also satisfied. And so I found that I had high satisfaction. About 80% or so agreed with a statement, "I learned as much as I expected." So they were satisfied with their learning. I also asked them after their HyFlex experience if they would prefer to choose the blend, like I gave them the option to. Most said, yeah, I agree. I prefer to choose the blend of courses, the blend of my participation online or face-to-face, but that wasn't everybody. Some students didn't want to make that choice. Some students, disagreed, said, "Look, don't make me choose, just tell me what to do. I'll sign up for it and I'll do it." And I think that is kind of evidence that not all of our students are comfortable with having all the agency and all the control that I can give them in HyFlex. Some of them would much rather be told where to go, when to go there, and what exactly to do in order to complete the course requirements. And these are even graduate students, adults who we think are so self-directed. Not everybody is that self-directed. And so that's an important thing. So what that tells me is that when I'm designing this course, I have to make it very clear to students that you can make the choice between being here in person or being an online student. But once you make that choice, then there are things for you to do. If you choose to be an online student, it's not just watch a recording and post to a discussion. We're going to do this, and then we're going to do these 5 things this week as an asynchronous online student. If you're coming to the live session, well, then there's an agenda for the class. Here are the 5 things we're going to do in class this week. And so I try to add that structure in there, especially for students who really need that structure. The students who don't want all that structure, they know that once they come to class, they have an ability to help shape the class. So there's a lot less structure in that classroom environment. So they tend to come there. What I found. I want to talk briefly about technology too for a little bit, because that's certainly an important part of the experience, because all of this, when we're talking about, especially the online, as you well know, is technology mediated. And so there are needs we have across all our modes. We have to have a good learning management system and its related suite of technologies to support student learning, no matter which mode they're choosing. And as well as to support me as the teacher in all the modes that I'm teaching. We have to have access to the network and devices. So if students are working remotely, clearly they need their own devices and they need some sort of network connection. But even in the classroom, I find more and more it's not just me using the network, but I want my students using the network. And if they have devices, I try to get them to log into the synchronous class as well. They're sitting in the classroom. I also want them in the synchronous stream if possible, so that they can be part of interactions with the online synchronous students during class. So we'll use the chat window. We may use some other back channel communications technologies, or we'll do breakouts. And if we're doing breakouts in class, I want some of those classroom students in the breakouts with the online students, because that helps us create this idea of a single learning community. It helps me keep in touch with the online synchronous students as well, so they know they're part of what's going on in the classroom. They're not just a satellite group learning on their own. In the classroom mode, the additional equipment we need clearly is audio and video, a stream from the class. Either just a stream for the synchronous students or a recording for perhaps reuse later. When we look at audio and video, clearly for us, the most important part of this is audio. We have to be able to hear well what's going on in the classroom in order for it to be meaningful at all for online students. The video stream is helpful, but in most classes, the video stream, I would say, is secondary to the audio. There are some exceptions to that. So if a professor is teaching with a whiteboard and putting lots of notes on the board, well, then the video becomes more important, because there's a lot of information that may not be available as well in the audio channel that's coming across to the video channel. And so in those situations, you might need an online whiteboard or maybe a smart whiteboard that can capture that, or maybe an extra camera or two to capture that adequately. For the online synchronous mode, clearly we need the audio and video stream from the class, but we also need to be able to hear and see students coming back into the class. And so students have to have access to a camera and audio so they can be a good participant in the class. Could students participate just with text on their phone or just listening and type it into the chat, maybe even on their phone? But yeah, it can work that way, but that's not how I would design this solution. We also need a web conferencing application, of course, and now these days we all have that. We've been using it for a year. For the online asynchronous mode, the really only the difference there is all this other stuff is important, usually served through the learning management system, but students also have to have the ability to communicate back to us using more than just words on a screen. So they have to have the ability to record audio and video for presentations, or maybe even participating in discussion forum posts with a little video clip. And so to the extent that you can support that, that is very powerful as well. This is also has become so easy for most students to have that kind of technology. If they walk around with a smartphone, they've got really all the technology they need to be basically operating here. One of the classes, one of the classrooms I use a lot is an active learning classroom. I don't know if there's a question in chat. If you have a question, you can just type it into chat, and I'll see it, and then I'll pause and try to answer it. An active learning classroom for us, it has basically movable furniture, and we have screens along the walls. And so I often use this for my HyFlex teaching. When I can, I get into this class as an assignment. There's a camera in the very back of the room here, and this is the one video change in this classroom compared to our other classrooms. We have web cameras on all the presentation computers and laptops and things like that, but this one has a back of the room camera. It could be used for lecture capture. I use it as another alternative video stream for the class. And so as well as the audio, sometimes I'll have this back camera on so people who are watching from remote can see what's going on in the classroom. They can see the motion that's happening. So that is, and this is not expensive, but it is a little enhancement. Some institutions that are doing more and more HyFlex have put cameras like this into all their classrooms because they see it as a valuable resource for the faculty to use. In the front, we have a teaching station, and it has audio and video controls right behind where the teacher sits. I can plug a laptop here, a tablet, or a phone in here, as well as the teaching station webcams on each one of those that we can select from. In the back, though, is where we have our audio controls, and we also have basically our AV controls. In our classrooms, what we've tried to do is put the same panel in every classroom, even if it has different technologies, so that it's the faculty only have to learn one panel to use. It's very clearly labeled, it's accessible. There's a button for video, and there's for different video sources. There's a button for audio. There's a button really for turning on the projection system. The microphone system that we have is just a wireless microphone system. Table mics, we put those around on the tables. We have two lavalier mics for faculty or presenters to use, so they can have the mic right with them. That becomes pretty important for crystal clear audio. And so that's the extent of the technology in this room. We could put the same audio video technology in any room for a lot less than it costs to outfit this room. This room was more expensive because of the furniture and because of all the screens. There's a brief question in chat. Have you investigated creating a special purpose website instead of a classical presentation support such as PowerPoint as a teaching support for a course, whatever the mode? I haven't done that in many, many years. That's where I started when the internet was brand new, before we had learning management systems. So we'd build a course website. But we have other faculty on our campus who use external websites or websites that they control. They could be inside the university firewall, but they still might use different ones. We also have faculty who use the publisher systems and use their websites as primarily as their kind of teaching source. And so it can work any of those ways. What I like about the learning management system is that students have the same access to all their courses in the learning management system. And so if I have faculty, when I was department chair, if I had faculty using an external site, I would tell them still, please, at least in the learning management system, provide a link out to wherever you are serving your students from, so they have a single point to get to all their courses. What's difficult, I had a daughter who went to my institution a few years ago. In one semester, she had 5 classes, and she had 5 completely different ways of getting access to those courses. One used our learning management system. Another one used a publisher website primarily. A third one had their own website built. I forget what the 4th one was, but the 5th one was no website at all. All they would barely used email, come to class and maybe exchange emails. So that's really unfair. It's unfair to our students. We don't tell our faculty they have to use our learning management system. But our students are the ones who really kind of pull them into that if they're not using it already. About 90% of our faculty use the LMS. This was before COVID. When I was an administrator, I could see that data. I don't know exactly what it is now, but I hope it's more than it was. There are other simple technology solutions that we use though. When I came back to teaching last January, we were in the classroom for a couple of months. The first time I came to my classroom, though, that was that nice active learning classroom. It has an alarm on it, and I came in and I tried to turn off the alarm, and it wouldn't turn off. So the alarm's going off. This is 10 minutes or 15 minutes before class, and so I called up our administrative assistant and said, "Hey, I'm using this alarm code." She said, "That's the right code. That should be going off." It's not going off. So then we call our security, our local security, and the security is supposed to come and find out why the alarm's going off, and then turn it off, look at my ID, and then let me teach. Well, they never showed up. And so I have students showing up and an alarm going off in the classroom I'm going to teach. It's my very first graduate course I'm teaching in 8 years. So thankfully I had a key to the room next door. And so I went in there and the alarm was not coming through the wall. It was quiet enough that we could teach in there, but I had no technology in there. So I just used my laptop, and for a small class, that actually worked well enough. But what it told me was the importance to have my own backup technology that works for the size classes that I need it for. Since I teach classes of 25 students or less, if I have a laptop or a remote webcam, like I'm showing here on the screen, and I have a little plug-in microphone that can be used in a conference room, that works well enough for a small class that I can actually teach pretty well synchronously with HyFlex that way. So now whenever I go to teach, I have a bag I take with me, and in that bag I have my webcam, and I have my plug-in conference mic just in case. There are other simple solutions that might be useful, and they're not expensive. Another one that many have been using this last year is this OWL camera, which gives you a 360-degree view around a conference room. It's designed as a conference room microphone and 360-degree camera. But a lot of people have used these, especially in smaller classes where the technology is easier to do and more portable. But we also have HyFlex courses that are being taught in much more high-cost classrooms or that are focused on different things. This is an example from Belgium. And in this situation, they wanted to increase the ability of the faculty to see the students who are live synchronous larger and in a natural place, as opposed to on a little panel on the side of the screen or maybe behind them when they're projecting in front of the class. And so in this situation, they created large screens, put 4 students to a screen in the back. So the technology costs are higher, the technology management, some staff has to help set all of this up. But they find that it's a better teaching experience for the faculty member. And if it's a better teaching experience for the faculty member, the assumption is that then it'll be a better learning experience for the students. One of the challenges, you may know this, if you're trying to teach students in the classroom and students synchronously online, is it's easy to forget about the students who are not immediately in your field of view if you're not intentionally trying to pay attention to everybody. And so when I'm teaching in a way like this, especially if I have, more than a handful of students in each one, I have a list, I have a roster, and I try to keep track, especially during the beginning of a semester when I'm trying to get to know everybody. I keep track of who I'm talking to, who's asking questions, who am I asking questions of, so that I'm not ignoring the people who are working online. And we can't require our students online to have their videos on. We have to give them the freedom to turn that off. We can encourage them to turn their videos on, but we can't force them to, unless we have a specific situation where they're doing some sort of performance, like delivering a presentation or a speech, or you know, maybe some other kind of course where they have to show movement. Well, then we can require videos on, but otherwise we can't require them to have videos on because they may have situations going on in their lives that, you know, they don't want on video, you know, kids running around in the background or people moving all over or whatever it happens to be. So we have to make sure that we're actively engaging them. And what that's led me to create is more engagement in my live classroom. So I do a lot more breakouts than I ever used to do, even in the classroom. So, you know, a 2 or 3 minute breakout to get started, you know, 10 or 15 minutes in, another little breakout doing something else or some other activity for them to be engaged in. 10 or 15 minutes later, you know, something else, so that there's never they know that there's never going to be a place where they've got half an hour where they can just disappear and still be counted on as being there because their little black box with their name on the screen is there. Okay, so technology. A resource that we have here that actually is available around the world is flexspace.org for looking at technology spaces and what's being used. And so institutions around the world can basically put in their own rooms in here and explain how they're used. Flexspace.org. If you give them, if you get an account free, no marketing, it's just a name and an email. And you can actually get into each one of these and see what's being done, and you can have a contact person you can actually talk to, and you can search on all things, including social distancing or physically distancing, including HyFlex and other kinds of things. So there's a lot of different resources in a resource like that. That's flexspace.org. I just use a real simple statement to my students. You know, I think it's important that we're, you know, supporting them in their experience so they know what to expect. I just say something like this in my syllabi, right? So this is a HyFlex format, and this is what we're going to do. You've got the choice, and if when you're making that choice, you know, this is what it means to you. When students go through this once, they get it after they've been through the experience. If they haven't, what I've learned is that if they haven't gone through a HyFlex course, you can tell them everything you want about it, but they don't really know what they're getting into. It's a different kind of course. I just read a brief little blog the other day, and it was from someone who had been teaching, you know, taught well online for years, also taught in the classroom well, taught a HyFlex course for the first time, and felt like she was a brand new teacher. She felt like she felt like this did not go like I thought it would. This was really hard for me to do as a teacher. And she had to come to the realization that it's a different kind of teaching. You have to learn how to teach this way. It's not just a combination of online and face-to-face. When you have everybody together there and you're trying to orchestrate this and you're trying to manage this and trying to facilitate this, it's a different kind of teaching. And until you kind of experience that, you can't really have a good understanding of what it is. And I think what that leads to is two things that happen, is that people will not go in unprepared because they don't think it's going to be any different. It's just an online, it's just a face-to-face. I can do either one of those. Doing it together is a different thing. Or they're very afraid of it. Oh my gosh, how could I possibly ever do that? So my encouragement is to when I work with people on designing this, we try to work on a design process and help them kind of get some confidence built on what's been done before, some best practices and what they can do, not for gold standard, but for good enough to get started, or to kind of build it as we go. But for the students, it's often the same thing. So I haven't invested a lot in lots of pre-course information for students because I know it's not going to mean a lot to them until they actually go through it. Some institutions that especially do this in more broadly in programs or multiple programs have their own websites about their version. This is Pierce Fit. Pierce College is one of the institutions in the United States that has done this across most of their programs. Small private school in Philadelphia, large urban place. So they need to be able to support the flexible needs of students. They call their solution Pierce Fit. So that's one example. Another one that just started this last summer, actually they launched this in the fall, HyFlex, Shenandoah University. Once again, a small private institution here in the States. They needed to have students back on campus. They could not wait because they wanted students to have the Shenandoah experience. And so for them, it was real important. So I worked with them over the summer on a HyFlex design, and they decided to call it ShenFlex. So they rebranded it for themselves. But it's a lot more information there for students because they wanted students to know, hey, we're going to take care of you. You come back to campus, you'll have opportunities to be on in the classroom, or if you're not comfortable with that, we will still serve you as one of our highly valued students. Okay. All right. Let's talk a little bit about some more student things. We can also talk more about assessment or engagement. If there's one of those things in particular that's more interesting to you, we can focus on that. The things that students find valuable, I mean, they always tell us they like to make that choice because their schedules are busy just like ours. A lot of our students are working. Some of them have family responsibilities. And this day and age, especially now, they kind of need that the ability to continue on with the course, even if they're exposed to COVID and they have to stay away for 10 or 15 days from the classroom. They still have to be, we have to find ways to support their learning, right? And so having a HyFlex course like that, if you have the asynchronous version of the course built, or even the synchronous version of the course available to them, they can still stay connected even if they're not able to come into the classroom if they wanted to, right? They can also often have more information to review. My online students like having the classroom recording to review. Some of the in-class students actually watch the recordings afterwards as well to kind of review what we went over in class, especially before an assignment or for a test, something like that. Students also are able to try out the online experience without fully committing to an online course. If you have students who have not taken a completely online course or an online course in your discipline, they might be reticent to do that because they may not be sure they could learn that way in your field or at your school. And so this gives them a chance to try those things out. So it also can improve access clearly. I've got some recordings from students. You can look at these on your own. You can look at the slides. They're also listed in the book. Every student here, these are all graduate students, and every single one of them talks about when there was a problem with audio, there was a problem with understanding. And so it just reinforced to me the need to get audio right in the classroom. I also asked my students to give me some hints and tips for other students so they can succeed in HyFlex. And so I have a list from, 3 or 4 lists of about, I don't know, there's probably 30 or 40 different tips from 3 different students in here that you can take a look at as well if you're interested in that. So I would encourage you, if you have students engaged in this, one of the ways to help make sure the student experience is working well is to include them in kind of the evaluation of how it's going and to make adaptations based on what they're telling you and ask them to be participating, especially if you're doing this kind of as an initial experiment on how this might work for you or for your course, is to ask the students to be involved in that. Okay, so you're going to have to find ways to schedule students flexibly. This is where we work with our registrar team to figure out how this can actually work. We don't have a HyFlex category in our registration system. Our registration system is controlled by our system, 500,000 students, 23 campuses. So we don't have that kind of level of control. So we have to find workarounds until our system actually makes one for us. So we might split a class into 2 sections, list one online, list one face-to-face. What we do in our program now is we list a single course, but we show different participation patterns available in the registration system. So now our students know, oh, this is a HyFlex course. It's got a classroom and a time and a date, but it also says online TBD, which basically means online asynchronous in our system. So we list it multiple ways for students to see. So you'll have to find a way to do that if you get beyond just trying it out for a semester. When we talk about where the faculty are and their overall experience, we have to ask ourselves, well, where are our faculty with the classroom teaching? We assume that's all effective, right? Sometimes when faculty go into HyFlex design, they actually end up redesigning what they're doing in the classroom too, because it hasn't been refreshed maybe in a few years, or they come up with some new ideas that make it actually more engaging in the classroom as well. Do they have experience teaching fully online? Do they have experience teaching in a hybrid format, right? What forms? And so all of that experience can help as they're thinking about designing for a HyFlex environment. We have faculty, when we take our faculty into a training environment, we usually start with their online or their face-to-face course, or traditionally a face-to-face institution, and we help them build an online version of that course, asynchronous, fully online version of that course. And then we talk about how we're going to teach, how they can teach this, at least in all these different modes, whichever modes they're choosing, and how they can, come up with strategies on how do they manage their workload. Building the online course is one challenge. That's a known challenge though. On our campus, when a faculty wants to teach a course online, they have to build their own course in most cases. And so they know that's an existing challenge. And so that's not such a big thing for our faculty. It's really the engagement and the facilitation that if they've never taught online, they may not fully appreciate. And we know that we don't have engaged students unless we have engaged faculty. So it's really critical that the faculty have the time, the interest, and the skill to engage the online students well for that to be a successful component of whatever HyFlex they're going to try to do. We have, if we're in a situation where we have the opportunity for students, for faculty to kind of ramp up slowly, we might tell them, start with 2 or 3 HyFlex sessions in your course, see what that's like, try it out, see what the experience is like for you, for your students, and then you can make a decision based on whether you want to expand that or not. Most of us are in a situation where we're not going to have that choice. The ramp up is now it's a big step up, right? We have to be, if we're choosing to do something like this because we have limitations of what's happening in the classroom, there's very little flexibility in kind of having to meet those needs. We have to have some online capability and we have to have face-to-face capability. And we're probably going to have to do it with the same people in the same courses. All right. There may be some other creative solutions out there. I know a couple of places where they're assigning an online faculty and a face-to-face faculty for a pair of courses. And so for 2 courses, they're still assigning, the university is still assigning 2 faculty for 2 courses. Well, 1 faculty for each course, but they're sharing the duties. And one of them is taking all the online capacity teaching part of it. The other one's taking all the classroom part of it. That can certainly work as a workload management tool. It does kind of split up, the students into, oh, I'm an online student, I have this teacher, and I'm a face-to-face student, I have this teacher. So it's a different way of approaching the same challenge. I also have some recordings of faculty talking about their HyFlex experience, and they talk about the things that they've liked and also the things that they haven't liked about it. These are 2 of the faculty from my own program. Once again, those videos are available through the book or through the links on the slide here. But in general, what some of the things that faculty value, students are absent from class. Well, they have something to do now. I don't have to make something up for them or just say, oh, well, we'll pick up with it next week. Just do the readings and come to class ready to talk about them. Okay, they're expected to attend as an online student if they're not in class. One of the things that I've appreciated the most is the third one on this slide, where I have the opportunity to stay more engaged with my students between regular class sessions. As a matter of fact, this has worked out so well for me. It does take more of my time, but it's time I'm more than willing to give them to help them continue learning more than just the once a week I see them in class. I've started now assigning asynchronous discussions for all the students. So even if you're in a classroom, I give you some time out of class to do the asynchronous online discussion. So if I have a class of 25, I might have 10 in the classroom, 7 or 8 online synchronously, and then 7 or 8 doing it online asynchronously. But they're all 25 are doing the online discussions. It's a much richer discussion when I have that many students as opposed to just 5 or 6 students. And they're all then engaged with each other and with me throughout the week. Usually 2 or 3 times during the week, they're popping into the discussions to see what's going on and to participate with posting. Okay. Now, real briefly, a couple of things about engagement. Engagement is one of the keys to the kind of the triangle of content, assessment, and engagement supporting the student learning outcomes, right? So engaged learning, and this is one of the biggest challenges I find with a lot of faculty. We talk about engagement with content, engagement with each other, engagement with the instructor. So kind of a classic 3 levels of interaction kind of component. And we also talk a little bit about this community of inquiry process. You may be familiar with this, but when we talked about building online courses a couple of decades ago, especially just with text, we said, well, it's important that people have to know there are other people there. They're not just words on the screen. So there's a social presence component. There's a teacher presence component. The students have to know that someone is structuring the experience for them, and the teacher's there and can be asked questions and will respond to questions. And the idea of the cognitive presence, there's stuff to be learned there. There's activity that are going to help me learn this. So these 3 different levels of interaction, these 3 different types of presence, all have to be there in our online courses in particular, but because they're all part of the classroom experience, but we don't often call them out because it's a natural way for us to be teaching and learning. And so I find ways to connect students so that we have the interaction, especially the social interaction and the content and the interaction and the presence with each other. So I do weekly reflection posts. So online discussion, everybody in the class does it, whether they're in class or online, and it's a way for them to tell me how things are going in the class. It's like an open journal, a learning journal that they do. I encourage them to change their mode if it fits their need. I do online discussions within class and online, students together if possible. If for some reason that's not possible, like the students in class don't have the right technology or it's too noisy or something like that, we wouldn't force this, but I try to look for opportunities to do that. When we're doing things in class, we try to create artifacts. Oftentimes I'd have them post something to the online forum for the week. Now we're doing more shared documents like Google Docs or things like that so that they can start taking notes, or maybe a breakout discussion they have in class is available for online students to see as well. And then some cases they can actually participate in, into adding notes to those pages as we go. I do a lot of peer feedback on assignments and things like that. And I subscribe all students to discussion forums. Now I require most of the students to participate in most of the discussion forums, not just encouraging them, because I think it's important to have them engage with each other as much as I possibly can. So in the classroom, what worked in the past might work well still, but the physical distancing requirements or social distancing requirements can be pretty severe. Some schools, students have the plexiglass, kind of compartments that they're in, and the teacher has the space at the front of the class and is not allowed to move around, and everybody's masked. In situations like that, that makes it very difficult to have a regular classroom experience like you had before. Okay, there's still the people there in the same room, which is important, but it's not the same as it was before. Okay, but we still have to look for ways to have students interacting, right? So the classroom, we know how to do that pretty well. And once again, that's another kind of thing that you kind of have to experience it to understand what the limitations are going to be. There's a couple of good resources that I found over this past summer. One's from Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. And this is a list of about 10 different active learning approaches that can be used in the active learning or in the hybrid environment, like a HyFlex environments, online, synchronous, as well as in the classroom, as well as socially distanced classrooms. And the other one is a document from Louisiana State University, also here in the US. And this is a Google Doc that people actually have been asked to comment on and add to as it goes over time. So these are a couple of resources. I'll show you them real quickly. This is the Center for Teaching site with their post, and they have a list of these 10 different activities that some of us, you may have used some of these in your classes before for interactions in the live classroom. And he's got ideas on how they can actually work in a physically distanced and hybrid space as well. The LSU document is just a shared Google Doc that you can look at and maybe find some value in. In the online synchronous environment, well, what worked in the classroom might still work pretty well in the online synchronous classroom. If you're doing breakouts in the classroom, you can do breakouts online. And I found I use a lot more of those than I ever thought I would, in particularly because I find that even small groups of students online, even 8 students in an online synchronous space, it's often hard to get them to talk about anything in the whole class. But if I put them into breakouts of 3 or 4 students, they almost always talk. If their videos are off in the big group, their videos usually come on in the breakouts. There's kind of a social pressure there. The expectation is that they're going to be more interactive. So that's an important thing to make sure that you're doing, is making them, giving them opportunities to interact, but also forcing the interaction. Make it so that it's better for them or more comfortable for them to be interacting, because you're putting them in a small group, you're asking them a direct question, than it is to stay silent. And then there's, of course, other things you can do. And there's a resource about facilitating discussions from DePaul University. You can take a look at that if you like. But good discussion facilitation has become even more critical than it was before. And I think it has to be more intentional now in an online environment. And I'm not going to talk much about that. Let me say a little bit about online asynchronous engagement. Clearly, if you are not engaged as the instructor, your students are not going to be engaged, most likely. I mean, they will follow your lead, and you set the expectations. And so what I find is that I dedicate a short amount of time, at least 3 times a week, for online forum interaction in each of my classes. And it might be as little as a half an hour, 3 times a week. before a particular class. And I find that sometimes I need that full half an hour, maybe a little bit more. Many times I don't need that much time. I need maybe 10 or 15 minutes and I can be kind of caught up. And I don't respond to every student. I don't grade every post. What I do is I grade students for participating. Are they participating or not? So it's like a 1 or a 0. It's a checkbox, check mark or not. And for me, for participation, they have to have their own substantial comments as well as some replies to peers. But I don't grade it with as much detail as a lot of other faculty will, because for me, it's not worth it. I try to do it by setting expectations and modeling it. And so that's what I do. So I make sure that I'm part of every thread. I used to tell students, start your own thread in our discussion and then reply to some threads of others. I've stopped doing that. Now I tell them that if is there already threads there and you want to put your comments, your initial comments, the most in-depth comments that you're making in this discussion into another thread, please do. Because if I have 20 students, I don't want 20 threads. That's not a discussion. Those are 20 little different, little group, groups of a person talking to maybe a couple of their peers who have showed up to listen to them. I'd rather have 4 or 5 threads with different subtopics that more people are engaged in, because then it's a much richer discussion. And I participate in each of the threads, but I don't reply to every single post. I read everything, but I don't reply to it. And I make sure they know that. There's other resources around engaging online students that might be helpful for you. And this is a book that's called Adding Some Tech Variety by one of my colleagues at Indiana, Kurt Bonk, and his colleague, Elaine Koo. And they've graciously provided all this available free online as PDF downloads. And so you can visit this site and take a look at any of the chapters. The ones I usually send people to are chapters 10 and 11 on interactivity and engagement. Another resource that you might find useful, this is about managing large classes. And if you have large courses, you have additional challenges. All right, how are we doing on time?
Well, it's quite good. I mean, if we can start to conclude now and leave about half an hour for questions for people attending the conference, that would be just perfect. I mean, but we're just arriving at the end of your presentation, right? From what I guessed.
I'm gonna put one more slide up.
Okay.
This is kind of the final thing I want to make sure I talk about, because I think one of the things a lot of us are looking at as well, how are we going to do things differently moving forward? Have we learned anything, even if we have another year of this inability to have our classrooms like we had them before? It might be longer, but even so, let's say we get them back sometime next year. I want to take a critical look at what we were doing before to see whether or not we were doing right by all our students that we're kind of signed up to serve. We're a public institution in a large state. And so our job is to provide access to a high quality education for as many students as possible. And we have been primarily a face-to-face institution, and we've always thought, well, this is the best way for them to learn. Well, and the truth is, it's not the best way for all of the students who need this information to learn, because they don't all have access. Some of them who have access just aren't good classroom learners. There are things going on that make that not as a good learning environment for some of them as it would be for an online version of that. And so we have limitations on our ability to serve in the face-to-face, just like we know we have limitations on serving everybody in the online synchronous space, just like we know we have limitations serving everybody in the online asynchronous space. None of these modes is ideal for 100% of our students. So what I'm hoping is that we have more of appreciation for when we can, if we can serve different kinds of students in the same courses and give students the choice, we'll be able to serve more of our students more effectively. So in the end, we end up educating more students to a higher level by giving them options, and options that lead to good learning, not just options that are just there for convenience sake. So those are the things I wanted to say for sure. But I will certainly, let's have some questions and answers, and you can actually, you should have microphones. You can ask your questions in chat or with the audio.
Well, I guess I have to start. I don't know for my colleagues. Well, do not hesitate, of course, to ask any questions through the chat, or if you need help. I was thinking about the different terms that were coined to describe actually HyFlex. I mean, you presented a slide with blended, flexible learning, and so many different expressions covering this subject. And I was wondering, watching this slide, if actually HyFlex is not an example of converging evolution in instructional design somehow.
Yeah, well, we've, 30 years ago, we shifted from looking at classic distance education towards online learning, right? When the internet became available to us in the early 90s or mid 90s, we started all of a sudden talking about online learning when we used to talk about distance education. And then around the same time, maybe a little later, I think we started talking more about blended learning or hybrid learning, when it became clear that we could use these online technologies in a regular classroom and actually make it a better learning environment. And then we thought, well, maybe we could even take time out of the class and move it online. And so then we came up with these more hybrid approaches and flipped classroom. And so HyFlex to me was taking a look at leveraging all the things we learned about using technology to support people learn, and then adding that together, but not making an either or, making it a plus and situation. So yes, we can do this in the classroom. Yes, we can do this online. What if we tried to do it both at the same time? Because we have students who need that flexibility, and we don't, as an instructor, we can't pretend to know what's best for our students all the time, right? We might think that, for this particular, for our class, it's better for them to be in the classroom than to learn online. But for a student who is paying an exorbitant cost, it could be financial, but it also just could be relational. It could be, work related, whatever it could be, to be there in class. It's very possible that for them, an online environment might be a better solution for them than the face-to-face environment, if we can help them learn that way. Okay, so yeah, I think the real difference here, and this is actually, I had to go through this when I was thinking about this in 2005, and I thought, well, if I do, is this any different than what we're doing already with hybrid or multi-mode instruction? And the thing that struck me was the difference is letting students make that choice, right? In education, formal education, it's almost always been, there's been a huge control over the student by the institution and the faculty, right? We tell them when to be there. We tell them when to leave in our classes. We tell them what to bring to class, what not to bring to class. We tell them what to do when they're in class, and maybe what not to do while they're in class. So there's a lot of control. So for me, the big thing I saw different was no one's talking about letting students make that choice. Right. When we talked about, I have good friends, Charles Graham at BYU, who's written books about how to design blended learning environments. And one of the things he usually starts out with is, once you decide, well, what are you blending? He talks about, and many people talk about, well, what's the best for the classroom and what's the best for online? In what blend gives you the best of both worlds? Right, but the best of both worlds from the deciding factor and the decisioning of the instructor or the instructional designer, who may or may not be taking into account the needs of the students for specific things, but that they can never take into account the specific needs of specific students on a day-by-day basis. Right, I had a medical emergency in the family. Well, but this week you're supposed to be in class because we've got the best thing going on in the class. I can't be there, right? I have to go to the hospital, whatever it happens to be. Well, sorry, then I guess you just lose out. The point of HyFlex is let's not give up the best of either, but let's let students make the choice, because for us, the best might be from an instructional perspective, from our perspective. You need to be here for this. It's really important for the discussions we're going to have. If a student can't access that, well, then it's not best for them, clearly. So how do we do that How do we do that well? So that's was the big difference. So progression, yeah, but I do think it's also, there's more to it than just a combination of modes. Yeah, there's another question in the chat too. Can I take that one?
Yeah.
Okay, this has to do with outcomes. Thank you for asking the question. Process versus activities versus outcomes in one of the slides. And this is when we talk about learning outcomes. I'm not sure if I have this ready to go, but actually when I talk about design, and we didn't really get to the design slides here, it's actually coming up next. Well, let me go here. When we talk about designing for a HyFlex course, essentially we go through, once we make a decision, yes, we're gonna try this HyFlex design piece. When we look at outcomes, content, assessment, and engagement overall, and then we talk about implementation too. But for all of these, I start with, well, what are we doing in class? What are we doing then online synchronous and or online asynchronous, depending upon what we're going to do for the online world. So when we look at outcomes, we look at the outcome statements. What's important is that we reach equivalent learning. It's not important, and really that means equal learning, right? We want equal learning outcomes for students. We want them to be able to meet the same learning outcomes. That doesn't mean that they're doing it in the same way. So the process we use to bring about those outcomes might be different for an in-class student compared to an online student, right? So we might use discussion board or interactive discussions or some sort of hands-on activity in the classroom. But if that's not available to the online students, then we find a different way to get them to the same learning outcomes. And oftentimes, reading, interacting with each other in online discussions can lead to equivalent learning, even though it's a different experience. So if the learning outcome is embedded in the process of the classroom, like students will learn blah, blah, blah by manipulating blah, 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 with some particular, or some equipment or whatever it happens to be, that's an outcome that has not just learning as part of it, but also process as part of it. And if I can separate the process out of that and just focus on the learning, then I'm more likely to be able to say, okay, I have an equivalent learning outcome, the same learning outcome in the online world, but I'll meet that different ways. So this becomes an important consideration for designers, because sometimes we'll have outcomes, and sometimes they're stated, sometimes they're not stated, but they're really embedded in process. Like the kind of a group project. Can you do a group project online? Can you do a group project in the classroom? Yes. But if you've got a group project that you've always done in the classroom, then your outcome, your idea of your outcome, your understanding of your outcome is probably pretty much embedded with, interacting in the classroom in your group to do the work of the group project during class time. And if you had online students, now what would you do with them if they're not going to be in the classroom? So that's one way to think about it. The other part of that is that even when we have the same activity in the classroom and online, classic is a discussion, a group discussion, it's a different experience. And so the process that students go through, it'll be, the words are the same. You're using words to explain ideas, but the dynamic nature of the classroom environment, the social nature of the classroom communication is so different than an online discussion. They really are two different things, even though they might lead to equivalent learning outcomes being met. I hope that answered your question. Another question in chat. What about the number of students that give up? Does the flex part help to reduce this number compared to full online students through engagement, I guess? Yeah, I think that if you compare it to an asynchronous online course, I think the HyFlex course is probably more engaging for students, because those students who want to be engaged and are very, are legitimately interested in this and have the opportunity will probably either come to class in person, or if you have a synchronous component, will engage in the online synchronous environment, both of which are more inherently engaging than the asynchronous environment. Okay, if I'm making a commitment to log in live on a Zoom session or whatever technology we're using, I am making more effort. I am making myself available at a particular time. I might turn on my video, I might have my audio, but I'm willing to kind of put that effort into. That's already more engaging. If I'm coming to class and when I don't have to, when I can make a choice and I'm coming to class, I'm commuting to campus. Maybe I live on campus, but I'm actually showing up there and I'm putting myself in the room with other people. that is already more engaging than just being part of an asynchronous online course. Okay, that doesn't mean that you can't be engaged in an asynchronous online course. I know lots of students and faculty who are highly engaged in online courses, but it's easier to be disengaged when you have less of a social presence. That's just, I think, a nature of kind of the human condition. So yeah, I think you have a better chance of keeping those students engaged. Some of the research we did on our campus, we looked at our student grades in online courses compared to face-to-face courses because we were concerned, and we found that our grade differentials among various populations on our campus, were X in the classroom. And when we went to the asynchronous online courses, especially larger ones, that difference doubled, right? So we had more of a problem with student learning in online asynchronous courses, and we think it's primarily due to disengagement. It's so easy not to be engaged unless the course is designed and the faculty is bought into teaching it really engaged. We've got good examples of those courses on the campus, but we have so many examples of the other side of that where it's just not engaging. Too many students for 300 students. How can you be that engaged with 300 students? You need some specific strategies on how to do that well. 1 to 300 is not a good engagement approach, right? So maybe 1 to doing like in groups, discussion groups and things like that, or peer mentors or other kinds of things. So you can do different strategies. But yeah, we know that that's a real problem. There was a research study in HyFlex done. It's one of the ones that's summarized in the book, I think in chapter 2.5. And they looked specifically at student performance, comparing a HyFlex course to a face-to-face course and an online course. And they found that the difference in learning they found between the online course and the face-to-face course went away in the HyFlex environment. Basically, everybody was learning as well as the face-to-face students section before. So the online student section, what would have been taught as an online section, now is taught as part of a HyFlex. The students who were in the online mode learned as much as the students in the face-to-face mode in the HyFlex course, but not when they were in separate sections. So what that tells me is that this nature of a single learning community, a single learning environment, even if I'm an online student there, may be more engaging to draw my engagement, which increases hopefully my learning, compared to having an only online asynchronous kind of experience. That's a very interesting study. That's the first one I've seen about that. It was done a couple of years ago. So I think there's opportunity there. As a matter of fact, now what I'm working on now is looking at equity in HyFlex courses. So I have a dissertation student, and I'm working on another committee and consulting with some other disserters who are working on their projects right now, and they're looking at, well, what are there equity issues with HyFlex, or does it help us solve equity issues? Looking primarily at underrepresented minorities in our country, Black students, Hispanic students, et cetera, where we know there are challenges with performance. And so my argument is that, well, with a HyFlex course, we give them the options, and if we give them support as well, we're likely to be able to serve more of them better than just with giving them online courses as a way of providing access. And so we want to know whether that's true or not, and what their experience is, and what makes them decide to come to class or not. Early research we did about 15 years ago, or actually 2012, so not that long ago, 8 years ago, we looked at Hispanic populations in our community college system in California, and found that when they took an online course compared to the same exact course face-to-face, same students, same college, same instructor, their scores were significantly worse in the online courses, and their dropouts were significantly more. And we did some interviews, and we found that most of what they told us was about the relationship. There was no relationship between them and the faculty member. They had no connection to the class in the asynchronous online class. They weren't able to connect. It wasn't part of how they were normally used to having a social relationship, like in a classroom. And so the question for us is, well, does that change in a HyFlex environment? If we give them the option and they participate in the classroom, does that matter to them? Is that better than doing it online? Or even if they have the option and they can participate in the classroom, but they don't, is the engagement overall better in the course? That can help kind of mitigate some of that, the impact of the asynchronous kind of disengaged learning environment that some of them experienced. Basically, do the faculty do a better job engaging them in a HyFlex course? So those are things we're looking at over the next year. So it'll take some time to get that stuff all out and published, but I'm hoping that we'll see some positive results there, because we certainly don't want to create yet another form of innovative ways of teaching that also don't provide the access we think they do, because they're disserving certain groups of students.
Is there any support provided for students regarding their learning experience online?
Well, we one of the things that a lot of our schools are learning now is that we have to be able to support fully online students. I mean, we've had to this last year. Part of the challenge, I think, a lot of us have seen is that we thought, first of all, this might only be a couple of weeks or a month or two, maybe till the end of the term. And so there wasn't a lot of investment put into fully online student support. When we started last year with, okay, we're going to be online in our institution, it was like, okay, we know the whole year is going to be online, and so we're just going to plan for that. We started becoming better at supporting online students with tutoring, advising services, and those kinds of things. Before, we never had that for our online students, unless a faculty member, put it together to create them. Now we're going to have systemic support services for online students, because we've had to build them for the pandemic situation. But we're not going to lose those services just because we're coming back to the classroom 50% or more. We'll still have the ability, because we've built now the practices and some of the system enhancements to make that work. So so I do think we're able to do that better now. Now, what I think what a lot of faculty do is they rely more on their office hours, online office hours, to work with students who are participating online and maybe don't have that opportunity for the active engagement in the classroom where they can ask questions. They can come in early, they can stay a little later and ask those questions or get their question answered in the classroom. So I think that's one of the things that we're seeing a shift towards, is more appreciation for that. On our campus, faculty were never even allowed to have online office hours unless you were teaching only online students. In some departments, even if you taught all online students, you still had to have a physical office hour on campus just in case someone showed up. Well, that's changing. So now I think the appreciation for more flexibility in office hours as well, because our students can, even a classroom student, is probably more likely to come to an office hour online and be as effective. So I think the answer is yes, and hopefully it'll continue. Hopefully we won't lose that. Yeah. So if you decide to try something like this out, you'll be one of thousands who are trying it for the first time. One of the things that I try to, I talk to faculty about and tell them, look, if you're not sure about how your classroom's going to work or how this might work, set up some sort of a simulation, get some of your colleagues together and, walk it through, put some people in the classroom, a couple of people online, and see what it's like to try to interact with both types of people, both participation modes at the same time. You'll find that, you'll need some different skills, but, they're skills that can be learned. Oh, you know what I was going to do? I was going to show you one more thing, and it's not in the PowerPoint. I know that's disappointing that's not in the PowerPoint, but let me show you one of the, let's see, is it here? I'm trying to show you one of my HyFlex course. And I think I have it. Yeah, let me put it right here. So I don't have this in the slides because this is my live course from last spring. Last spring was the last time I taught in the classroom. And so this is a course that I built for that class. And so I had taught this course before I went to be an administrator. So like 2012. And then when I came back, this is the first class I agreed to teach. And I agreed to teach it like 2 weeks before the class started. So I had very little time to build it, built it from scratch again. But it's a 15-week graduate seminar in digital project usability testing, kind of like user experience testing. And so this is as good as I could come up with in 2 weeks. But I went for good enough design, right? We have a quality online learning and teaching metric rubric we use, kind of like Quality Matters here in the States that a lot of people use. And I follow those principles, but I don't try to meet 57 different factors in every course. I go for a basic 20 or so and then go from there. And so the information is there for students, you know, like any other course. I have them all introduce themselves. So this is students who are in class, online, it doesn't matter. You're going to introduce yourself, and then it pops up over here on the right side. So every time we come back into the class, a different student's name comes up there in their brief little bio. I have them do reflection forum posts. And so this is what that looks like. Every student in this class, this is a very small class too, because they only had 2 weeks to realize, oh, Dr. Beatty's teaching, I'll take his class. And they were supposed to reply 14 times. This course was affected by COVID. So it was a little less, it was a stranger experience than I've ever had. But this is that kind of forum that then they post every time they post back to. Now I have a class of 25 and 20 and 15. And so there's a lot more threads in there, but this was the one thing. What I do then is I give them a live link. And so they're invited to be in the live link, whether they're in class or not. And then I do recordings. And so each of these recordings were from a class session we had. There was a lot of group work in this session. So by the second half of the semester, we didn't meet every week. They were doing some project work. But that was it. I mean, that was the basic thing. And so each of these recordings, then they could go back in and watch them. And then every topic has its own little section. It has an agenda. It has a discussion forum for them to be part of, and there's additional resources. And so if they came to class, hopefully they did the readings. We have a discussion, interactive discussion in class, sometimes presentations, other kinds of interactions. That's all shows up in the agenda. And then we might post things into the discussion forum or in a shared document. I didn't use shared documents in this class. And then they come on for the next week, and then we just go on from there. So it's a really simple design. I built it as an online asynchronous course, so it would support fully online asynchronous learners. And then I used it to teach students in every mode of the class. So it gets a little richer as we went in there. So I wanted just to show you that it doesn't have to be complicated, but it does have to be, I think it does have to be a good online course experience for students. Now I'm teaching a little differently. Another thing I've done, I have 1 more minute. Let me just show you one other thing I've done. This is a different kind of course I teach. But this course I pre-record. This is a shorter course. Videos, about 8 to 10 minutes, roughly, maybe 15 or 18 minutes, I guess. Sections of me talking through content. This is the kind of course where there's no book, and so it's more of the content I'm providing to students. And so I want to make sure that I cover all the content in some way, even if we don't get to it in class. And so we always run out of time. We're doing something fun or having a good discussion, and so I don't get to everything I intended to, but I have it pre-recorded for students then to listen to. And it's more efficient. There's no student voices in there. I can reuse it from term to term because there's no student voices in there. And it's also more direct and focused mostly on content as opposed to the interesting discussions from the class, which are all, show up in the other discussion forums. So those are a couple of different approaches I use to teach a HyFlex course, all focused on starting with the online course and then using that to teach in all the different modes. All right.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Beatty. I don't know if there are any more questions. Doesn't look like it. Well, so thank you very much. That was exactly as I expected, very inspirational, definitely, especially considering the times we're facing right now.
Right. Yeah, we have a moment here, and so we get to be the ones who decide where we go from here. So, not everyone has their own opportunity, of course. This happens to be ours.
Yeah, so we have to decide which path, which way we're going to take instructional design on for the years to come. But I definitely think that HyFlex offers a wide wide range of solutions.
All right. Well, thanks for inviting me.
Thank you very much for giving us a bit of your time. And we hope we can maybe discuss this further. And I guess that all the participants here will be happy, for example, to consult the resources that you suggested in your presentation. Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.